Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here, my next Airspeed's Avatar Rewatch video. This one's going to be for Book 2 Earth Episode 7, Zuko Alone. This episode is animated by JM Animation, and yeah, it's definitely one of the best episodes of Book 2. I think it's a kind of standout episode in the entire series as well, because that flashback is so important, and I think since the show has ended and the comics have come into play, this has become an even more important episode in that the comics now answering a lot of the mysteries presented by this backstory means that bringing everything together, this episode has so much meaning because we now more or less have most of the full story to what happened here. The only thing in terms of the flashback that we're kind of maybe missing is Iroh's perspective on, things before Liu Ten died, how exactly he was feeling during, and what he was up to kind of while this Ursa Ozai stuff was actually going on here. In that clearly some of the more important moments in Iroh's life happened in and around the death of his son. So, that's the side of things we don't know, but because of the Search comics, we know the details behind where Ursa went, what happened with Ursa. The details behind why Azulon died so suddenly like this. We know all that stuff now. And then the present day stuff in this episode is also very interesting because it is Zuko on his own. And we're seeing him on his own here for like the first time and see how he kind of does things. And, it's not just a case of he's just, blue spirit going around the place, stealing from people. He's making decisions, like the very start of the episode. He doesn't want to steal food from, this family who he's going to steal until he sees that the woman is pregnant. Now, of course, it's a really nice reference here because this family happens to be Than and Ying, who are obviously the parents of Hope, who's born in, the Serpent's Pass. So it's really cool to see their first appearance here in this episode, and then they later come into play even before the Serpent's Pass and so on. So that's a really nice one that he made that decision. He could have just stole their food, but he didn't want to. It's showing that as much as he's struggling with decisions, he's still the person that we know he is, which isn't all anger, all about capture the Avatar. And it's the theme of the present day stuff is obviously the idea of kind of presenting that even though the Earth Kingdom is technically on the good side of the war, some of their people are still almost just as bad, if not worse, than the Fire Nation, because here are soldiers who are here to protect this small town in case anything happens in terms of the war. And they're basically using the fact that they're important as protection for this town to basically control it. Instead of this being this thing of everyone banding together, they're using the fact that, realistically the Fire Nation aren't going to attack this small town. We have huge power because we're the protectors of this town, and using that to their advantage to basically steal anything, even though they are doing nothing compared to some other soldiers in the war, which obviously we're really meant to feel for the family that Zuko encounters here, and specifically Lee's older brother Sensu, who they joke about and kind of insult him for being captured, and they joke about what happened to him when it's basically implied that he was killed in everything that happened here, even though he was one of the ones doing more for the war, the Earth Kingdom, than they were. And it's I think that's a really interesting dynamic that they managed to create in this episode, using characters who we only meet here, like this the main thug guy Gao. This is the only episode we really see him in. Lee and his family, we only meet them here, but it's a nice dynamic for Zuko to interact with, and seeing him have this family which is so nice to him, and he, in a way, without even trying almost, does a lot for this family in terms of protecting them and teaching Lee some things, which is quite interesting. That the characters we have here are Gonsu and Sella, who are the parents, Lee, and then Sensu, who's out at war. And immediately when he meets the full family, I like that Lee's kind of bringing him home, and he's just like, okay, look, you can eat with us, we'll feed your ostrich horse, and this is like to basically pay you back for stepping in and not getting me in trouble with the soldiers. But Zuko's immediately like, no, I can't do this, and Sella basically realizes what's going on here, and it's just like, okay, you can work with Gansu for a while, and then we'll eat. So like, just the idea that Zuko specifically wanted to like earn the kind of food he was going to get, and again speaks to, you know, the honor that Zuko actually does have, even though his main arc as a character is him feeling like he has to get his honor back from his father, which is, you know, a big thing by the end of this episode, and what his mother says to him, the last thing she ever said to him, you know, like, never forget who you are. And it's the Zuko's whole arc is effectively, even as Iroh eventually ends up pointing out to him, is basically, you decide that yourself. Right now, Zuko's going off basically what Ozai has told him to be, rather than who Zuko actually is, or who everyone who actually knows him well knows him to be. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic throughout this whole episode. I'll get into the flashbacks later on, so I'll just cover the present day stuff for the most part now. You know, we get the idea of him giving the dagger eventually to Lee after him, you know, teaching him a little bit about the swords. And especially with Lee, like, I like this idea that like he's really missing his older brother who used to teach him these type of things and kind of be that role model for him. And Zuko kind of ends up filling in that role for a while, to the point where, you know, Lee actually wants Zuko to stay if his father's going to figure out what happened to Sensu, if he was killed or not, by going to the front. He wants like Zuko to kind of stay in his place, and I think that speaks to how kind of close they came very quickly, and how it was this kind of almost like a replacement in a way. But eventually it ends up being that obviously Zuko ends up standing up for them again. It leads to the big fight at the end, of course, and Gao versus Zuko is a very interesting fight because it's, you know, I like that they just, with Gao, even though he's just a very, you know, generic thug, I like how they put a lot of effort into giving him a very distinct fighting style and like just making him a threat, because he's a very strong and powerful earthbender. Ultimately, any sort of like technical bender who was like skilled enough could probably defeat him, because all he had going for him was power. But it speaks a lot that Zuko, just with his swords, not using any bending, was able to, you know, stand up quite well against him. And it fits in, I suppose, with the theme of some of the backstory of the idea of like Zuko with the knife, and that kind of prompting in a way Zuko to learn how to do non-bending fighting as well as bending fighting, because he was struggling initially early on with bending, whereas it seemed like he actually had there was something with Zuko and like bladed weapons that was actually good. And obviously in the lore we know that he is thought eventually by Piandao, and that's how he becomes as skilled as he is now. But it's you know, telling that, you know, it is a really high level skill that Zuko has, that he's able to sword fight as well as he can, to the point where he holds off a very powerful earthbender for a pretty long amount of time, and only just gets overpowered because he just faces this barrage of earthbending. And he eventually has to firebend here, and it's very obviously significantly timed with this part of the flashback that he kind of remembers. But he blitzes Gao basically as soon as he starts using the firebending, and it's like the only time we ever see Zuko really use his firebending in combination with his swords, which is one of those things where, like, in terms of Zuko as a fighter and really analyzing him compared to everyone else, it's just like, it's kind of hard to judge Zuko's level, because he's exceptionally skilled as a firebender and he's exceptionally skilled as a sword fighter, but most of the time he does them very separately. When he sword fights, he's sword fighting. When he bends, he's bending. He rarely ever uses them in tandem, and it's hard to judge if, like, is this some like master level skill that actually like puts him over the edge of everyone, or is it just something that he happened to do here because he had to, like, while sword fighting, quickly revert to using firebending. I'm not sure, but it's a pretty cool thing if we ever got to see him use, you know, firebending with swords again. And yeah, I think that the interesting thing, of course, is that even after he firebends and is asked who he is, he could have easily have just said that, like, I'm some random firebender, or, you know, I come up with some story that like I left the Fire Nation and I'm just traveling around trying to find myself or whatever. And he probably could have like got away with this and become somewhat of a hero of the village. Maybe there would have been some tension with him and the villagers because he's a firebender, and obviously that being the unfortunate thing of this war, in that it really has turned everyone who's not from the Fire Nation against the Fire Nation, regardless of like, you know, basically personality or honor level or anything like that. So any firebender was realistically going to get some sort of like criticism from this town. But I think it's the fact that Zuko just so blatantly kind of says that, you know, I'm Zuko, you know, Crown Prince of the Fire Nation, you know, son of Ursa and Fire Lord Ozai, heir to the throne, and he just expects everything to be fine. And it's obviously, this is Zuko's response to remembering the part of his flashback when his mother says to him, you know, never forget who you are. And it's really signaling that still relatively early on in Book 2, despite all the experiences he's had, meeting Song and her family, and just experiencing what like his father is sending out, and his sister is trying to hunt him down now, they're fugitives, he still is reverting back to who he is now, is the Crown Prince. He has to get that back, he has to get his honor back. That's the position that he wants and thinks of himself as still, that he still wants to be the Crown Prince of the Fire Nation, and that he wants to be, you know, Ozai's son and get his respect. And Iroh, of course, his perspective is that he's very aware that that is not really who Zuko is. Iroh obviously knows his brother enough to know that Zuko's never going to be someone that Ozai cares about, and that, you know, obviously Zuko's kind of misinterpreting his destiny and who he is, really. As for the flashback, it's really, really well done, as I said, and with the context of the stuff from the search in mind, it is so much, I think, better. I think if you haven't watched Zuko Alone since reading the search, go back and rewatch this episode and, you know, try and connect the dots. It's really, really interesting how it all comes together. The first bit that happens is, oh yeah, it's Ursa and Zuko feeding the turtle ducks, and immediately we get this sense of like, they are presenting young Azula in this flashback very interestingly, and I think if the future of the comics for Avatar is to properly address Azula's arc and who she is and have some sort of redemption for her, it's not just a case that like it's Ozai's influence on Azula that has kind of made her who she is. That this seems to be very much suggesting that just naturally Azula is kind of inclined to be very manipulative, very controlling, cruel in a way, because she clearly showed Zuko her throwing rocks at turtle ducks, and then just the way she reacts to basically everything that goes on. The gifts that Iroh sends them, she just is just like, you know, how dare he think I'd want a doll. She burns it, and just, she has no respect for Iroh because Iroh doesn't act like the standard Fire Lord that she knows. Or I think that is a sense of, you know, Ozai's influence of just that he's clearly been teaching her solo a lot, and that this is a point at which you can clearly see that there's been this big kind of fracturing within the family dynamic. Of course, we know because of the search that there's always been that fracture there, that it's never been close, that the family's never been fully together, but there's maybe been a sense of it trying to happen, because obviously the issue is that like it was an arranged marriage. Ursa was pulled away from the person she actually cared about and forced into this marriage with Ozai, and he immediately made it clear that he treated Ursa like property, and there was no connection ever really between her and Ozai. The only positives for Ursa in her time in the Fire Nation were that she does care about both of her children, and she actually was quite close with Iroh, hence why she is so sad when they hear about the death of Liu Ten from the siege of Ba Sing Se. And I like this because it makes it clear that like Zuko is affected by the death of Liu Ten as well, because there is I think it's in like book 3 they established that like they Luten and Zuko to some degree know each other, or at the very least, there's been moments when like Iroh, like had Zuko and Luten together, and he kind of looked after them for a little bit, um, and there's that, and maybe it's also these moments where like this is where Azula really learned to develop her like lack of any sort of like trust or faith in Iroh, and I think it's interesting as well that she just sees nothing in Iroh when everyone in the fandom immediately would acknowledge Iroh as being one of the most powerful firebenders of all time, but she just sees the jolly old man, the tea, and doesn't see any of the power that he actually does have, or any of the wisdom that he has, which is very interesting in that you kind of would have to say almost that the one person Azula has never like analyzed properly is Iroh. That she even after all of these times when like he has actually bested her by being the one person to like until Zuko to redirect her lightning, like properly get an advantage over her in any sort of a fighting situation, it's been him. She still doesn't seem to have any sort of like respect for him, even in the sense of like acknowledging how strong he is. So, you know, that's a dynamic I'd like to see more of. Of course, there's some hope, I suppose, within the fandom that they'd maybe have Iroh take on a similar role to Zuko now that you maybe will have with Azula, where he steps in acknowledging that she's had issues and she needs his help now, just like Zuko did in the past. But it is, I think, more of an issue between Ursa and Azula than anything really. But yeah, the Iroh is the one, of course, who gives Zuko the dagger. It says, you know, never give up without a fight. And it's meant to represent Zuko, who, the whole idea of, Azula was kind of born lucky, I was lucky to be born, like, I've always had to fight my way, never give up without a fight. That's Zuko's motto, that everything he has to do is always through hard work and perseverance, whereas Azula gets it spot on, and his kind of, you know, goal kind of in life, his mantra that he goes by is this, and that kind of makes him who he is. And as obviously Azula just gets the doll, yeah, and we see as well in other little moments of just like Azula talking very openly and not really in any way aware that what she's saying is just like, you probably shouldn't say that, talking so kind of casually about, oh, you know, now that Luten is gone, shouldn't like, you know, Dad become the Fire Lord because there's he has no family, and you know, to some degree it must come from the fact that Azula and Ozai, and maybe with some like one-on-one training sessions or something like that, he must be telling her this stuff, but at the same time she's also intelligent enough and calculating enough back here that it could just be herself saying this as well. And it's the one thing like with Ursa where she's just like, she clearly cares about like Azula and isn't so like concerned about Azula that she just keeps Zuko away from her, in that when Azula asks like Ursa to let Zuko play with them, she's just like, yeah, just go play with your sister, you know, you can come back in a while. It's not this case of like there's just nothing there, and especially that's why I like the comic as well, The Search, in that it adds an extra thing to a lot of this situation of showing that, you know, she does care about Azula, but she is also concerned about Azula, that she is so, you know, blunt about like, what if this person died? What would that mean for us? And so on. And it's kind of very much trying to manipulate almost every situation, in that she manipulates her mother into getting Zuko to play with her. It's not just asking her, it's like, can you make this happen? And so on. So there's definitely that like sense of like calculating cruelty still there in her, even though she's so young at this point. And it obviously, the big moment is the meeting with Azulon that Ozai calls, and I like this one because there's a few things here. The first one would be we see him basically have Azula do a kind of firebending demonstration, and we see that her fire is kind of orange-red fire, whereas we know Azula in the present day has blue fire, showing that it's not just a case of like she happens to, whenever she bends, and when she bent for the first time it was always blue, that the blue represents that she is so skilled at this point that she has managed to like make her fire hotter while still having the same level of control over it, which I think is a really unique thing that like that's something that like not even like Ozai can do, which speaks to the fact that Azula has this skill that even Ozai doesn't have, whereas like Iroh and Zuko can kind of counter some of that by the fact that they have the whole learn from the dragon's kind of dragon fire type thing, which most people consider to be like a match. Like if you have dragon fire, it's a match for blue fire. But yeah, that's a interesting dynamic. But Zuko then does the same demonstration and fails completely. And I like that with Azulon here, it wasn't a case of just like he dismissed Zuko because Zuko was bad. He actually just kind of like talked to Ozai and immediately just like, why did you show me either of these things? Just tell me immediately what you want from me. And he sends the rest of them away. Obviously, Zuko and Azula stay. Azula stays for the full thing. Zuko leaves after a while. But this is the most interesting thing. Ozai asks Azulon for the birthright. That he basically says, Iroh has no family to continue the line on. I have a family. Give me the birthright and I'll continue it on for you. This will be the best for the Fire Nation. And, you know, it's one of those ones where, like, you can, from Ozai's perspective as him being power hungry and, like, seeing this as his chance, you get maybe why he asks. But again, it speaks to the whole thing of, like, both Ozai and Azula. They're so calculating and manipulative that they don't kind of realize that you should show some sympathy at this moment. Like, this is maybe the thing to ask in a couple of months when maybe Iroh hasn't returned to the Fire Nation, isn't showing any sense of like stepping up as the Crown Prince, then you ask for it. But like, as Azulon says, the fact that you ask while everyone's kind of still in mourning over Lu-Ten is the big issue here more than anything. And we obviously get from Azula later on that, you know, teasing Zuko about it, that effectively the Ozai's punishment for asking for something so, you know, at such bad timing and showing such disrespect to his brother is that Ozai should suffer the same punishment of losing your firstborn child. And the idea is that, you know, Ozai might have to kill Zuko. And now in the Search comic, obviously what immediately happens after this is Ursa takes Azula out of the room, which is what we see. And immediately we see in the comic that scene of Azula telling Ursa exactly what happened. And then Ursa going to confront Ozai about this. And this is where the plan comes into play. Because in this episode, what we see next is suddenly the next morning, like, oh yeah, Azulon died in his sleep last night. Ozai is now made Crown Prince. And everything works out in Ozai's favor, and Ursa has gone missing, or gone apparently. They keep that a mystery, and it's one of the mysteries of the show overall, that they never say specifically what happened to Ursa. It's obviously the book 3, the big confrontation between Zuko and Ozai, which is when we get the most insight in the show in terms of what happened. With the Search in mind, we know exactly what happened. That as Ursa was she banished? Yes, but it was kind of part of a deal with Ozai that Ursa would supply Ozai with the method to basically kill Azulon in his sleep and make it look like he just died naturally. And clearly, you know, they in the process kind of forged things so that, you know, if him dying so suddenly, Iroh nowhere to be seen, they forge a letter and make it look like he was made the heir to the throne, the Crown Prince in his kind of dying wish. And this is how, you know, Ozai gets the throne. This is why he, as a secondborn, is the Fire Lord, and Iroh, who we know is older than Ozai, that's why he is not currently the Fire Lord right now, which has always been the sort of question, and it speaks to that here, that's we find out what exactly happens here, and the Search gives us the full story, as I said, and it's interesting because obviously, like, Ursa's history, as they explain in that book, is that her parents are kind of like master herbalists, and so they know how to, like, they obviously know how to make cures, but equally they know what not to use and thus know how to make poisons, and they found this way to make an untraceable poison, and that's what Ursa supplied to Ozai. Now, obviously, it's a case of, yes, she supplied this, and the fact that she came up with this plan speaks to, like, oh, I didn't know Ursa was capable of that. But she didn't do it herself, and part of the deal was that Ursa had to kind of go missing, basically, and stay away from everything, and it's the sacrifice she made, basically, to save Zuko from everything that was about to happen. And it's, it's obviously a very tragic story in terms of what it means for Zuko, in that this episode, what it did do very well was make it really clear how obviously fractured the family was, that it was very much a case of Azula and Ozai, and then Ursa and Zuko. And pretty much Zuko didn't interact much with his father, and the implication was that Azula and Ursa, not that there was just nothing between them, but that because Ozai just did not care about Zuko, which we know of because of the comic as well. The comic does a really good job at showing why just Ozai, more than just the fact that Zuko's not skilled, the comic explains more specifically why Ozai just has no interest in Zuko whatsoever, and seems to actively just dislike him, which is obviously because of the whole, like, Ursa trying to kind of get one over on Ozai by saying that Zuko wasn't actually his child, and that's part of the plot of the search. And as revenge, basically, for that, Ozai basically chose to make Zuko's life basically a pain. And so the result of this is that Zuko's left with his sister, who is always trying to kind of, get one over on him, and then his father, who just doesn't care about him. So it's obviously been a extremely tough few years for Zuko, but despite all that, he still managed to keep quite well in terms of, like, the war meeting came up, and we know that he was still a pretty good person up until that moment. The idea, I think, being, and I think this is part of the story that I'd like to see, and it would probably come from Iroh's, if we ever got Iroh's full story of this incident, is that Iroh probably, like, returned from his, like, mourning or whatever happened in the immediate aftermath of Loot 10, obviously because his father died, and there seemed to be a good relationship between those two, but also because I think Iroh was aware of the issue between Zuko and Ozai, so he would return, and I suppose that's maybe where their connection comes in a lot more heavily. We know, obviously, that Iroh, in the aftermath of Liu Ten's death, says that, ever since my son died, I treated you as a son. So the idea being that this is probably where Iroh comes back into the picture to kind of more closely look after Zuko. And I'd like to see a little bit more of that in the past, how exactly that came about. In terms of, like, was it pretty immediate after this that he came to play, or did Zuko have a couple of months where he was just pretty much on his own with just a sister and father who he was, like, terrified around? I'd really like to know all that sort of stuff, but the Fire Nation royal family history is really, really interesting. But I think the result of this episode would be that, like, I would say anyone, like, if you haven't read The Search yet, read it. It's really, really good. It's definitely the most impactful of all the comics in terms of, like, big things that happen that are meaningful to the story. It's definitely the biggest. But Zuko Alone is a excellent episode on both sides, both the flashback and the present day stuff, and it just leaves Zuko in this position of, like, even we've thought he's been having this growth of finally maybe abandoning capturing the Avatar, trying to find a different path, but now he seems to have doubled down on the path of trying to get his honor back by capturing the Avatar. That's the only way he can get back to being who he thinks he needs to be, which is at Ozai's right hand as the Crown Prince. And we, Iroh, all know that is not the case, and this is Zuko misinterpreting his destiny, but this is part of his journey on his own, trying to figure out these things. that has been my episode review. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on this episode, as well as what I had to say here. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.